They tried to throw me out of my own home, but they didn't know I was their new lawyer. The street was quiet the night I moved in, porch lights glowing, crickets humming, the kind of peace you wait years to earn. For a moment, I thought I had finally found home. But peace doesn't last long where power hides in the shadows. Within days, the letters began. Under my door, cold notices slipped in, threats sealed in envelopes, strangers walking my property line with clipboards as if they already owned it. It wasn't protection, it was intimidation, and it escalated fast, from warnings to fines, from fines to eviction. They weren't just interested in my house. They were pursuing me. But what they didn't realize was simple. I wasn't just another resident. I wasn't their victim. When the HOA tried to evict me, I didn't panic, I didn't run. I stood my ground, and I used the one weapon they never saw coming: the law. The first night I slept in my new home, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Silence. A deep, almost sacred quiet. The hum of crickets outside. The faint glow of porch lights flickering along the street. I stood by the window, coffee in my hand, telling myself, this is it. A clean slate. I had worked hard for this. Long nights, endless cases, sacrifices nobody saw. This house wasn't just a building. It was proof that I had survived every storm life had thrown at me. I also believed I was finally safe as I unpacked boxes and hung pieces of my story on the walls. But peace can be fragile. Sometimes it shatters without warning. And the moment I discovered the first letter, my started to crack. It was tucked neatly under my door, sealed in a plain white envelope. There is only a folded piece of paper stamped with authority, no return address, and no smile. At first, I thought it was a welcome note, perhaps a recommendation from the neighborhood, but when I opened it, the words hit like ice water. You are breaking the rules of the community. Immediate compliance required. I remember staring at the page, confused, whispering to myself, violation? Even though I hadn't been here long enough, nothing had broken. My yard was clean. My trash cans were in the right spot. The house was painted precisely as I had purchased it. Nothing made sense. But this was only the beginning. At first, I laughed. A violation notice? For what? My curtains were too tightly drawn. My grass wasn't smiling enough. It seemed ridiculous, but the laughter didn't last. Because by the end of that week, there were 3 more letters, each one colder than the last. The language was sharp, almost predatory. Failure to respond will result in fines. Immediate action is required. Non-compliance may result in legal proceedings. Legal proceedings. I had barely unpacked, and suddenly my sanctuary was being treated like a crime scene. I tried to ignore it. I told myself it was probably a clerical mistake, a misunderstanding. Maybe the HOA just didn't know I was new, but the truth was far darker. This wasn't an accident. A test was held, a way to see if I would bend. One Saturday morning, I was outside trimming a hedge when a pair of shadows fell across my yard. 2 figures stood on the sidewalk. One was a woman in her 50s, hair pulled tight, eyes sharper than glass. The other is a man with a clipboard who believes that paper grants him authority. The woman spoke first. "Mr. Carter?" The stiffness of someone who had rehearsed the line 100 times was evident in her voice. "Yes," I said, setting down my clippers. She crossed her arms. "I'm Margaret, president of the Homeowners Association. This is Daniel, our compliance officer." Compliance officer. The words rolled off her tongue like a badge of honor. "We've sent you several notices," she continued, "but you haven't responded." I raised an eyebrow. "Notices for what, exactly?" Daniel read with a robotic precision as he raised the clipboard. "Improper mailbox design. Design. Non-standard blinds. Front yard vegetation exceeding community guidelines." I almost laughed again, but Margaret's expression made it clear. This wasn't a joke. My mailbox was standard. My blinds were the same as half the street. And my fence, I was literally trimming it when they walked up. "What happens if I don't fix these issues?" I asked, my voice calm but edged with steel. Margaret drew nearer. Nearer. Then Mr. Carter, the association will take more drastic measures, including removal, eviction. That word lingered in the air like smoke. From that day forward, it felt like I was living under a microscope. Every action I took, every light I turned on, and every sound coming from my yard was watched. I'd leave for work in the morning and come back to find new letters taped to my door. Noise complaint, decoration without permission, failure to maintain lawn height. It made no difference that none of it was accurate. They weren't documenting violations. They were building a case. And it wasn't just paper anymore. One night, I caught Daniel parked across the street in his car, engine off, staring at my house. Margaret was at my fence one evening, measuring the slats with a ruler like a suburban detective, and I found her there. The harassment was suffocating. They weren't trying to make rules happen. They were attempting to harm me, to push me into surrender, into selling my home, into running. However, they had no idea who I was. No, not yet. Because while they were plotting my eviction, I was preparing something far more dangerous. At first, I thought I could brush it off. Just ignore them, focus on work, live my life. But harassment has a way of seeping into your bones. It doesn't scream, it mumbles, constantly, until there is nothing else you can hear. I began to dread returning home. The house that once felt like sanctuary now felt like a battlefield. Every time I pulled into the driveway, my eyes darted to the mailbox, bracing for another letter. Shame turned my porch light into a spotlight, my windows watchtowers. Sleep didn't come easily anymore. I would lie awake, replaying my conversations with Margaret and Daniel, while looking up at the ceiling, their smug faces. They disguised their threats as rules. My thoughts would twist and turn, and I would keep asking myself, why me? It wasn't just the HOA. My neighbors began to view me differently. Whispers behind hedges, curtains shifting when I walked by. Rumors spread faster than wildfire in communities like this. To them, I wasn't a new neighbor anymore. I was an issue, a troublemaker. At the grocery store, I overheard someone mutter, "That's the guy the association's dealing with." Another day, a neighbor who once waved at me turned her head away, pretending she didn't see me. I wasn't just getting letters and rules from the HOA. They were turning the entire neighborhood against me. One stormy night marked the low point. Rain hammered the roof, and I sat in the dark living room sipping cold coffee, my nerves frayed. That's when I heard it. 3 hard knocks at the door. I froze. For a moment, the house felt alive, pulsing with the echo of those knocks. Slowly I stood, heart pounding in my chest. When I opened the door, nobody was there. Just rain pouring down, soaking the envelope taped to the wood. A different letter. This one was different. Bigger. Thicker. In the midst of the storm, I tore it open. Inside was a formal notice. Final warning. Immediate compliance required. Failure to vacate voluntarily will result in legal eviction proceedings. Lightning flashed overhead, and in that blinding second, something inside me shifted. Fear curdled into fury. The doubt, the sleepless nights, the shame, it all hardened into a single realization. They had no idea who they were dealing with. I sat back down at the kitchen table, the letter still dripping in my hands, and for the first time in weeks, I smiled. Certainly not because the harassment was amusing, but because I finally remembered who I was. I wasn't just some random homeowner. I wasn't some lost soul they could bully into submission. I was something they didn't expect, something they didn't prepare for. I was a lawyer, and they had just declared war on the wrong man. That night, something inside me clicked. I wasn't going to hide anymore. I wasn't going to cower under their threats or drown in their letters. No, I was going to fight, and not just as a homeowner desperate to save his house. As the lawyer who had spent years dismantling cases built on lies, I was going to fight as who I really was. I cleared the kitchen table, spread out every notice, every warning, every scrap of paper they had shoved under my door. The rain outside had stopped, but in my living room, the storm was just beginning. Every word they had written, every violation they claimed, I picked it apart, line by line, one paragraph at a time, and what I found made me laugh out loud in the silence of my home. Half of their claims weren't even supported by the community charter. The other half? Pure intimidation tactics. I bought a small camera and mounted it by my window. I started documenting everything. Daniel's car parked across the street, Margaret measuring my fence, every letter taped to my door, snapshots, timestamps, organized folders, evidence for the storm that was coming. I kept a journal too, every incident logged, every conversation written down. Margaret accused me of non-standard blinds. Daniel observed my hedge height. It was absurd, but absurdity can still be dangerous if left unchecked. Weeks passed, and instead of breaking me, their harassment became fuel. Each new letter wasn't a setback, it was ammunition. I dug deeper. Public records, meeting notes, financial reports. The HOA wasn't as powerful as they pretended. In fact, they were sloppy. Margaret had a history of pushing out neighbors who stood up to her. Daniel was no compliance officer. He was just another board member with a title that sounded official. But the most damning discovery, several housing laws had been broken by the HOA itself. They were so busy trying to trap me that they hadn't realized their own foundation was crumbling. One night, under the soft glow of my desk lamp, I leaned back in my chair, staring at the mountain of evidence I had collected, and that's when I made the decision. I would not just defend myself. I was going to enter their arena as a judge, a challenger, and an equal, not as a prey. I was going to be my own lawyer. And when the day came, when they finally filed their so-called eviction proceedings, I would be ready, more than ready. Picture this: the camera pans across my home office. Stacks of papers, neatly labeled files, a voice recorder playing back Margaret's sharp tone. I was jotting down strategy notes with my hands moving across a legal pad. The soundtrack? Not fear, not doubt, but quiet determination. Because this wasn't just about me anymore. This was about every person who had ever been bullied into silence by people who thought their titles gave them power. And I wasn't going to let them win. Late one night, after hours of sifting through files and cross-referencing laws, I leaned back in my chair and stared at the ceiling. I was so tired that my eyes hurt, but my mind wouldn't let me rest. Why did I exert so much effort? Why not simply leave, sell the house, and start over elsewhere? That would have been the simplest choice. However, a part of me refused. There was more to it than just four walls and a roof. It wasn't even just about me. It was about something far more substantial. I thought back to my younger days, the nights I spent in law school, working double shifts to pay tuition. The professors who advised me, the law is a weapon, but only if you know how to wield it, and the interminable lectures and mock trials. I remembered my first big case, a single mother being bullied by a landlord who thought she had no voice. She was advised to give up and quietly leave. But I stood by her, piece by piece dismantling the lies until she won. I saw the relief in her eyes, the gratitude in her smile. That night I promised myself something. I'd never let injustice walk past me unanswered. And now here I was again, older, scarred, tired, but still holding that same promise. The HOA didn't just threaten my home. They threatened the very principle I built my life on, that nobody has the right to abuse power without being challenged. I walked into the kitchen and poured myself a glass of water. On the counter sat a framed photo of my father. He wasn't around anymore, but he had been the one who taught me resilience. When someone tries to corner you, he once told me, don't just push back, make sure they never try it again. I touched the frame, feeling the weight of his words. This wasn't just about Margaret, Daniel, or their petty rules. The fear was gone. The doubt was gone. Only determination remained. The HOA wanted a fight. They were going to get one. But they weren't ready for the way I would bring it. Because when the courtroom doors opened, they wouldn't just see a homeowner fighting eviction. They would witness a lawyer, their lawyer, entering the arena with a fiery expression on his face. And that's when everything would change. The letter came on a Tuesday morning. Official, stamped, signed. The HOA had filed for eviction. Most people would panic when faced with those words. But when I opened that envelope, I felt nothing but calm. I had been waiting for this moment. The battlefield wasn't my yard anymore. It wasn't my fence or mailbox. The courtroom was in sight, and that was my arena. I didn't need to. The truth was on my side, and I had been living inside their lies for months. The morning of the hearing, the HOA board sat together like a smug pack of predators. Margaret in her pressed blazer, Daniel clutching his clipboard as if it were a shield. They laughed softly, whispering, glancing my way with the confidence of people who thought the game was already won. But when the bailiff called the case and I stood, not as the defendant, but as counsel, their faces drained of color. I still remember the look in Margaret's eyes, that fleeting glance of recognition, that moment where her certainty cracked. I said with a steady voice, Your Honor, I'll be representing myself in this matter. The room shifted. The judge raised an eyebrow. The HOA's lawyer shuffled his notes nervously. The dynamic had changed in an instant. I wasn't prey anymore. I was the hunter. Their lawyer presented first. A stack of violations was paraded before the court. Photographs, letters, a binder full of nonsense. He spoke with confidence, painting me as a negligent homeowner who disrespected the rules of the community. But as he droned on, I could see the flaws in every sentence. No foundation, no citations, no actual violations tied to enforceable rules. I did not hurry up when it was my turn. I walked to the center of the room, held up their binder, and began dismantling their case one page at a time. Improper mailbox design, I said, flipping the page. According to Section 3, Subsection B of the Community Charter, my mailbox is entirely compliant. Exhibit A, non-standard blinds? Section 5 states that blinds must be neutral in color. The same beige blinds have been approved for the other half of the street. B. Exhibit, front yard vegetation exceeding guidelines? Interesting, because Section 8 doesn't list a maximum hedge height. But if it did, let's compare photographs of the board members' own homes. Exhibit C. Gasps rippled through the room as I laid out photographs I had quietly collected. Margaret's overgrown hedges, Daniel's mailbox painted a non-standard color, and several other board members blatantly violating the very rules they tried to enforce on me. I wasn't done. I grabbed the journal. Every date, every incident, every piece of harassment meticulously logged. Then the photos of Daniel's car outside my home, Margaret measuring my fence in the dead of night. This, I said, holding it high, is not enforcement. This is harassment. This is abuse of authority. This is a board weaponizing rules to intimidate residents. The judge leaned forward, his expression sharpening. The HOA's lawyer stammered, trying to recover, but the damage was done. On the floor, their credibility was eroding. The final blow then came. I presented the evidence I'd uncovered in their financial records, misused funds, improper filings, and direct violations of state housing regulations. You came here to evict me, I said, voice rising with conviction, but in truth, it is this association that has been operating outside the law, and I will not stand for it. Not for me, not for any resident. Silence hung in the room, like a held breath. Finally, the judge spoke. The eviction is denied. Furthermore, based on the evidence presented, I am ordering an investigation into the practices of this association. Margaret's face went pale. Daniel's clipboard slipped from his hands. The entire board sat frozen, their empire crumbling in real time. After gathering my documents and buttoning my jacket, I silently passed them. Their power had evaporated, and they knew it. But the story didn't end there, because in the weeks that followed, the board fractured, members resigned, the investigation widened, and when the dust settled, the community needed new leadership. That's when the irony hit full circle. I wasn't just the man they tried to evict. I was elected as their new legal counsel. I was broken by the HOA. Instead, I became the one thing they feared most, the voice they could no longer silence. When the storm was over, I stood in my living room again, the same place where weeks before I had stared at a dripping eviction notice, broken and exhausted. But this time, the silence felt different. Not heavy, not suffocating. It was clean. It was victory. The letters stopped coming. The late-night knocks vanished. The stares from neighbors shifted from suspicion to respect. And for the first time since moving in, my home truly felt like mine. But the real win wasn't just the house. It was knowing that I had stood against something bigger than myself and won. Looking back, I realized this fight was never really about hedges or blinds or mailboxes. It was about control, about power, about how small groups of people sometimes believe they can use intimidation and fear to control other people's lives. But here's the truth. Bullies thrive in silence. They feed on compliance. They win when good people decide it's easier to walk away than to fight back. And that's exactly why I couldn't walk away. Because every time someone gives in, the cycle continues. I think about my father's words often. When someone tries to corner you, don't just push back. Make sure they never try it again. That's what this fight was. Not just for me, not just for my home, but for every neighbor who ever felt powerless. For every resident who ever thought they had no choice but to obey. For anyone who has ever questioned whether they are strong enough to stand. So yes, the HOA tried to evict me. They tried to humiliate me. They tried to erase me from the place I had worked my whole life to earn. But in the end, I wasn't just another name on their list. I wasn't their victim. I was their new lawyer. And that title? They didn't give it to me. I earned it. Now I want to leave you with this. If you've ever faced people who thought they could control you, who thought they could silence you with fear, Ask yourself one question: what if you fought back? Because sometimes the battles we don't choose are the ones that shape us the most. And if you want to hear more stories like this one, raw, dramatic, and true to the bone, then don't just scroll away. Hit that like button, subscribe, share this with someone who needs to be reminded that they're stronger than they think, because the conflict is not solely mine, it's yours too.